Lamb, Australian lamb. Very good. Have a barbie, get in a boat, hang out with your mates, include everybody. Sounds good. All right. Here are the Home Affairs values. So a couple of things I think stick out: respect for the freedom and dignity of the individual, commitment to the rule of law, equality of opportunity for all people, a fair go. A fair go seems very Australian. It embraces mutual respect, tolerance, and compassion for those in need, and equality of opportunity for all. Talks about the English language being the national language. I didn't want to highlight that because I'm not convinced that that's a good idea, but or at least I don't think a single language is a good idea for most nations, but I'll try to circumvent that controversy for the minute. So the government thinks we have values, and I see these values working in a defence context represented in ADF doctrine. So you do see the translation of these kinds of ideas in terms of trying to find a cohesive, solidifying focal point for organisations and society. The reason I mention this is because we want our AI that we create, sovereign capabilities we create in Australia, to hold fast to values that we can all endorse. And we're at risk when we import AI technologies from other nations and cultures and countries where those values may not align. And certainly from a defence context, that's a really interesting question, because we have allies. Australia has many allies, and each ally has but slightly different cultures. So imagine if Australia was forced to have the UK's or the United States' COVID policies, for example, instead of the ones that enabled Australians to not die in massive numbers. So if we were forced to take on all of the digital products of other cultures, we would be forced to take on a lot of their values too. Now I can't seem to, oh, there we go. All right. This is the Australian AI ethics principles. I've put them all on the slide, mostly because everyone can have access to the slides, like Kevin D'Souza, after this presentation. So it's just a handy dandy reference. But the Department of Industry did publish Australian AI ethics principles at the end of 2019, with the intention that they be utilised by all government departments and also by corporate structures and businesses in Australia. They wanted these to be accepted and adopted. The main point of difference between Australia's principles and the rest of the world is this idea sometimes of contestability. Now, again, because I work in defence, this contestability point has been noted internationally as a possible point of tension for Australian defence if they adopted these, because it is a sort of an Australian value to question leadership, right? To have perhaps not less respect, of course, but to be a bit of a larrikin and to, well, hang on, boss, you know, should we really do things like that? It's probably tied into the innovative and imaginative sort of rebellious bushranger culture that we've got, that we would think that contestability is really important. But having listened to Rachel this morning and Tim as well, it's really nice that the global AI governance culture is starting to recognise that this contestability is a really core part of what is considered AI ethics. So while contestability seemed a bit unique and perhaps stood out at the end of 2019, it may be that Australia is really leading the pack on having that as a core principle. But how to actually enable that is another question. So Australia signed on to the OECD's AI ethics principles. Again, I'm not going to go through these too thoroughly, but just to be aware that in the AI action plan for Australia that was published by the federal government in about June this year, they reiterated their support not only for the Australian national principles, but for the OECD principles that have had the greatest amount of influence globally on governance, national governance structures for AI. So Australia is sort of part of the leading progress there. And just this week, UNESCO had 193 countries, nations, all agree to an AI ethics framework that I highly recommend you read, because it's a good framework and it has an extraordinary amount of mutual commitment. 193 countries don't agree with much. So the fact that Australia is a signatory to UNESCO and has agreed, it's just worth being mindful of. A really important report this year by Santo was the Human Rights and Technology Final Report 2021. As soon as this report was published, Santo exited the federal government as a Human Rights Commissioner and went to UTS in Sydney. The Australian government has not appointed a new Human Rights Commissioner. So we are currently without some leadership there. But this report is very thoughtful and is very sensitive, I think, to some of the issues have been raised in the consideration of the ABS statistics. So a lot of opportunity for these this data to be to affect people's rights. And so the human rights impact assessments recommendation, I think, is worth your awareness. And this report recommends that the Australian ethics principles should be utilised in conducting those assessments. From the defence side of things, Defence has not adopted or announced a specific AI ethics policy at this stage. There's a commitment, there's a Defence Data Strategy 2021 to 23, which does outline a plan for Defence to create an ethics framework suitable for Defence and Defence data. The Method for Ethical AI in Defence report, when I was working for Defence Science and Technology Group, I was lead author of that. Now I'm no longer working for that group. So it's a little bit self-aggrandizing to mention it, but it is the only thing we have at this stage that has come out of Defence, published by Defence. It took a year to get this out of Defence, so I'm very proud of having managed to get it to the public, because if you don't have the courage to have a conversation with the public, then you're sort of missing a basic idea of ethical behaviour. You don't have to share everything, but you need to be able to have a conversation with the public. And Defence needs, Defence is, their obligations under the various acts, the Defence Act that they have is to the elected government, the civilian government of Australia, and the civilian government is obviously democratically elected by the Australian public. So the Australian public should know how Defence is thinking. And currently, this is what Defence is thinking. There's a framework there. This is relevant for Defence. It's not necessarily relevant for your organisational group, but it is aligned with a lot of the best practice, with a particular sensitivity around the particular harms that Defence capabilities are capable of producing in terms of force application, and they require a very specific set of principles and behaviours, particularly Australia's commitment to international humanitarian law and Article 36 reviews of all means and methods of warfare. And Australia basically needs to make sure that they uphold the highest level of integrity with regards to acts in Australia's defence. But it makes it harder for Defence to adopt a civilian principles framework, which usually the first principle is AI must not cause any harm. That's going to be a problem for Defence to sign on to. So they need to figure out if they're going to be causing harms, how are they causing harms and why are they justified if they are ever justified. If you're a pacifist, you probably don't think much of Defence, but if you think in just war theory terms, there may be just wars and there may be just uses of force by Australia. So far, this method's got some really good feedback internationally. So Zoe Lockman says, while not a formally adopted view of the Australian government, the method is the clearest articulation of ethical AI for defence among the Indo-Pacific allies, as well as one of the most concrete practices that US allies have thus far developed for AI ethics implementation in defence. And what Zoe's talking about is really the pragmatic methodology that I'm about to go through before I finish up. Let's see if this works.
There are 4 tools that may assist in identifying, managing, and mitigating ethical risks in defence AI systems. 1. The Data Ethics Canvas by the Open Data Institute encourages you to ask important questions about projects that use data and reflect on the responses, such as the security and privacy of data collected and used, who could be negatively affected, and how to minimise negative impacts. 2. The AI Ethics Checklist ensures AI developers know the military context the AI is for, the sorts of decisions being made, how to create the right scenarios, and how to employ appropriate subject matter experts to evaluate, verify, and validate the AI. 3. The Ethical AI Risk Matrix is a project risk management tool to identify and describe identified risks and proposed treatment. The matrix assigns individuals and groups to be responsible for reducing ethical risk through concrete actions on an agreed timeline and review schedule. 4. The LEAP is a Data Item Descriptor, DID, for contractors to defence to develop a formal legal and ethical program plan to be included in project documentation for major programs that had a significant AI component. The checklist, risk matrix, and LEAP are all available in a Method for Ethical AI for Defence report at dst.defence.gov.au/ethical AI. For more information on the ethics of robotics, autonomous systems, and AI, contact Trusted Autonomous Systems. Info at TAS-D CRC.
All right, you don't need all of that. Trusted Autonomous Systems is the first defence CRC and is funded predominantly by the Next Generation Technologies Fund of the Commonwealth Government. However, it is a separate legal entity to the government. So I serve defence, but I am not an APS person anymore. So I have a kind of opportunity in some sense to speak more easily and freely about things. So that's the connection there. And Taz was a co-author of the report. And actually Tristan Prez, who's here today, is one of the primary contributors to the methodology that we recommend, which involves the understanding of the decisions being made by the AI. And so if you don't understand how the decision-making process is going on, and you're not able to verify and validate, that the algorithms and the systems and the models and the data are doing what they say that they're going to do, then you're not going to be able to adopt and trust these systems. And you're not going to be able to explain them either. So the explainability conversation really dovetails with the part of this, which is understanding the decisions. And understanding decisions requires expertise in decision sciences. And if you don't have someone who has expertise in decision sciences in part of your team, you're going to need to get a consultant, someone like Tristan, to come in to your team to try and explain the sort of process you need to go through. It's just not enough to think you know what's going on here if you don't have this more deeper background. Okay, so that's the quick set of tools. So that's the data ethics canvas. No point in bending the wheel here. So the Open Data Institute has a great canvas. So we recommend that defence industries use this canvas when they're working on AI projects with TAS. So we make sure that they abide by security protocols when they're doing AI for defence projects. There's a lot of security issues that you may appreciate. You don't want to be training your AI data set for a defence purpose on open data sets or ImageNet, right? It's a very bad idea. Don't image roulette your defense applications, right? Do not create slaughter bots, bad idea. So all data sets really need to be impeccably collected, curated, managed, both from a security perspective and in the sensitivity with regards to what the purposes of using that data is in the AI application. And this canvas is a very pragmatic tool to help people with no background start thinking about things that matter and that they need to be accountable for. The AI ethics checklist. This helps people process why they're developing the AI that they're developing. So the first thing you need to figure out is what's the context that you need this AI for. And in the military, do you want this for a logistics robot that's just going to chuff up and down, 36 squadrons, very long hallways and reduce the number of steps people have to take? Then there'll be a certain kind of risk, sure, obstacle bumping and things like that, and anthropomorphization. It's a big different context than applying AI into a force application or a weapon. So you just need to be clear, what's the context for deployment? What's the decisions it helps with? How is it integrating with human operators appropriately? And how are you making sure that you're preventing potential misuse of the product? Explain the frameworks to be used. So, this comes from one framework, this method, right? But we're seeing these emerging best practice methods are happening quite quickly in global society. So just for you and your group and your stakeholders, what are the methods that your group needs? Do you need a domestic privacy law environment? Do you need international humanitarian law? You've got to gather about you the right frameworks for your stakeholders and explain what you're committing to in your AI project. Make sure you get the subject matter experts if they're not in-house, and mostly they're not because you need a bunch of different skill sets, and get those verification and validation techniques on those algorithms. So that's the checklist. The risk matrix is like the most easy tool in the universe because you already know what a risk spreadsheet looks like. So you've already probably used safety checklists. You've probably already thought about project risks. If you've ever done any project management, risk management is part of what you do. It just says you can do the same thing with ethical risks as you do for any other sort of risk. It's not just a random philosophical idea or an abstraction. You can quantify them and put limits around how much you're going to mitigate any risk. And then the degree to which you mitigate risks will affect what operations and what deployment you can do with that product. And the more care you take, the greater likelihood your IP and your AI is going to be usable by your client for a greater range of purposes. So it's going to be more valuable for you to put more energy into risk mitigation around ethics and legal issues. And that's where the commercialization benefit is for industry to invest in this kind of project planning. The LEAP is a more formal document to work with acquisitions inside defence. I'm not going to go into details on it, but it's just to say that if you're creating a weaponized platform and you intend to use AI with it, it's going to be a very, very sensitive proposition. And there's a lot of reasons why the public are very concerned about any form of AI in weapon systems. So you better do a very good and thorough job of explaining to the Australian government why your system meets all the requirements of an Article 36 review. Probably running out of time, so I'll probably just end there, which is just some details in what a LEAP would contain. So I'm just going to skip past those. IEEE Standards in 2021, there's been an extraordinary amount of work been published. I just draw your attention to it. I think it's a very good starting point of how to address ethical concerns during system design. The standard on transparency is very, very relevant for explainability. And the ontological standard for ethically driven robotics and automation is great. I've actually paid for it. It's my first paid for standard, so it's great. It's just as great as I hoped my $140 US would cover. And this is just a very simple and easy way to just do things in an ethical manner. And this is what we utilize at TAS. So thank you very much.